Simon & Schuster AudioWorks presents Star Trek: The Next Generation. Gulliver's Fugitives, written and adapted for audio by Keith Sharee. This program is read by Jonathan Frakes.
The end of everything heralded itself as a metallic hum near Montoya's left ear. No need to turn around and look. The hum had to come from a one-eye, a lead-colored object about the size of a human torso, with a single staring camera eye and a bristling, spiky penumbra of antennae. It was gliding behind Montoya's head, intercepting and reading his thoughts. Montoya knew his only chance for survival was to keep from thinking about the small case that rested lightly in his hand. He ignored it, shut his eyes to it, hummed a tuneless tune to forget about it. What the case held was of no monetary worth, yet was valuable beyond reckoning. To possess it here on the planet of Rampart was a crime punishable by death. In spite of his efforts, fugitive thoughts that lurked in the shadows of his mind came to him. He heard the one-eye come closer. Two broad-shouldered figures, their white uniforms bearing the blue cephalic security logo, confronted Montoya. One of the CS men pulled at the case in Montoya's hand. Montoya let it slip out. They guided him along the wall to a cage-like elevator. He started to weep. The lift emerged onto the roof. Montoya let the sobs shudder through him, tears streaming down his face. The CS men led him within a few meters of the roof's edge as they approached the door of the hovercraft. Suddenly, Montoya flailed out with his cuffed hands, causing the surprised CS man to lose his grip. With all his strength, Montoya grabbed at his case, ripping it right out of the other CS man's hands. With a triumphant yell, he flung the case outwards. The case opened as it fell toward the ground far below. Yellowed, old pages fluttered free and scattered in widening gyres on the wind. He smiled to himself. His trick, his sadness, had worked. A sop for the one eye, so the device wouldn't guess at his spontaneous last act and kill him to prevent it. He kept his eyes on the pages as they grew smaller and smaller. A 100 CS officers and special agents converged on the area where the pages had fallen. They all wore protective helmets with electronic visors that turned printed words into gibberish for their eyes. 100 CS officers quickly set up roadblocks and evacuated residents, then set to work finding the scattered pages and burning them in portable mini incinerators. One page had floated far. It alone had escaped the CS and their incinerators. It lay nakedly on a small patch of grass behind an elementary school. At noon recess, a red-haired girl from the third grade class chased a ball and came upon the page. She had never seen such an old and discolored piece of paper. She picked it up and with big green inquisitive eyes looked at an illustration on the page. It appeared to be of a man tied onto a kind of sled and surrounded by a busy swarm of people no bigger than his finger. She read the words on the page. About 4 hours after we began our journey, I awaked by a very ridiculous accident. For the carriage being stopped a while to adjust something that was out of order, 2 or 3 of the young natives had the curiosity to see how I looked when I was asleep. They climbed up into the engine, and advancing very softly to my face, one of them, an officer in the guards, put the sharp end of his half-pike a good way up into my left nostril, which tickled my nose like a straw and made me sneeze violently. The green-eyed girl laughed. She looked at the top of the page and saw a title line, Gulliver's Travels, A Voyage to Lilliput. She sensed that the page was something forbidden, something the grown-ups told you to never, ever touch or look at, or you'd get a disease. But her fascination with the page overcame her caution. She hid the page in her dress, hoping to take it home that day. Counselor Deanna Troi sat in her cabin on the Enterprise. She was about to fulfill, in her own way, the primary mission of the USS Enterprise: exploration of new worlds and discovery of alien life. To begin observations, all she had to do was utter a single word to the computer. She sounded it in her mind: Tukurpa. She began to feel vertigo. The feeling intensified as if she were spinning faster and faster. She couldn't focus her eyes. The walls of the cabin were disintegrating. She felt herself thrown out of her chair, tumbling through space. Then she hit the ground, face down. She lay still for several moments, regaining her equilibrium. Then she realized the ground was hot enough to burn her skin. She quickly got to her feet, and with a devastating shock, saw that she was in the middle of a wasteland, desert. I wasn't alone in that desert. A great matriarch, as big as the planet itself, was there too. Troi stopped for a moment, and Captain Jean-Luc Picard watched her with concern. She lived in the ground, and I never saw her, but she gave me water and kept me alive. There were dangers she couldn't protect me from. There was a predator that looked half like a lioness and half like a human. I escaped from it, but in the night I was confronted by another danger, a giant man whose skin was like a mirror, in which I saw images of war and apocalypse. Somehow, I woke myself up. I'd been in front of my computer all along, and yet I had been to another world as well. They're real, Captain, and they're close to the ship. I feel them as other-worlders. Picard questioned her gently, then told her he was going to scan the area around the ship and try to discover who the alien beings were. He assured her the ship's computer would keep track of her vital signs. After she left, Picard wondered if he'd been too distant with her. She often reminded him that he needed to show more emotion. They even had a meeting on the subject scheduled for today, a meeting that had been postponed many times and would have to be postponed once again. Wesley and Data sat at their consoles on the Enterprise bridge, waiting for the ship's sensors to scan the surrounding space. Data touched his keypad to reset the external sensor for new frequencies. There. We must now wait for this sequence to compute. Perhaps, Wesley, this is a good opportunity for me to present you with my gift. Data assumed a heraldic pose. The teachings of Macaroon Erotica, doing a little thing we call three-toed minty fresh logo tissue. Quest for the golden aphids, where they call the wind, Mr. Conceited be gone. I walk down spanked Mandrelstrasse with gently yielding fun bladder under warranty. Prometheus, indicator light blinking, through the hydrogen eternity, boo, boo. Data looked at Wesley. The ensign was laughing. A puzzled, almost sad look crossed Data's face. That was not the reaction I had anticipated or hoped for. I thought I had composed my first artistic poem. Suddenly, Data looked down at his console. The indices were changing rapidly. We have found something. The recorder marker from the Huxley was not what we were looking for, but it's a major find nonetheless. The others in the conference room, Data, Troi, and First Officer Riker, listened raptly to Picard. The Huxley's Captain Bowles had been one of the fleet's great explorers, and the fate of his ship was a major unsolved puzzle in Starfleet's history. The marker has yielded few facts, but it seems the Huxley was attacked by other ships in the Rho Ophiuchi Nebula. Starfleet has asked us to enter the nebula and check a certain planet for survivors. Number 1, you and I will meet later to plan the particulars of this mission. That's all. Troi looked out the port of the dense blue veil of the Rho Ophiuchi Nebula. More than ever, she felt the hidden presence of the otherworlders, and she began to shiver. Seated at the captain's left, Troi watched the planet grow larger on the bridge view screen. Picard rose slowly from his command chair. Sensor information, Mr. Data. Coming in range now, sir. I'm picking up electromagnetic transmissions from the surface band. Put it on screen if you can. This is Jean-Luc Picard, captain of the USS Enterprise, from the United Federation of Planets. The bridge screen filled with the face of a human male in his mid-30s. He wore a military-type uniform. I am Major Ferris. We know you come from Earth. You have entered the sovereign space of Rampart. We want nothing to do with you. That is why our ancestors left Earth 200 years ago. I assure you, Major, as commander of the Enterprise, the Federation does not wish to interfere with your affairs. We are here merely to investigate the disappearance of the USS Huxley. Ferris's back was now to the view screen. He seemed to be getting advice from some other authority. Another man about 20 years older took his place. I am Crichton, Director of Cephalic Security. Your investigation would be a waste. There are no lies on this world. Your story of the Huxley is a deliberately concocted fiction. I suggest you take your ship and leave. Picard looked at Deanna Troi. What do you feel about Crichton? The counselor replied without hesitation. He's telling the truth as he sees it. I am sure he has never heard of the Huxley. Picard's voice tightened. Do you, Crichton, know anything about the disappearance of the USS Huxley? Absolutely nothing, Captain Picard. Then Crichton looked down and pressed a button on his desk. Picard stared at the view screen. Crichton, your weapons are no match for my ship. You're going to limit both our options if you fire on us. And even if you did destroy us, other Federation ships would come, one way or another. The Federation will have its answer. I'm not firing, Captain. It would neither deter nor destroy your Federation. I will allow your investigation, but I will tolerate no interference in our affairs. We have an epidemic going on here and a violent insurgency. If your people help them, they will be criminals as well. Your search can begin now. All you have to do is allow us to inspect your ship to assure us you carried no infections or forbidden materials. As Troi walked down the Enterprise corridor with the visiting party, she was aware of a metal box floating along behind her. Its lens zoomed in and out, and its antennae beetled at her, then at Picard. Crichton and Ferris called it a one-eye. They had brought several one-eyes onto the ship for the detection of contraband or disease. The search went on for hours. Crichton had just stopped the tour near the holodeck when Picard lost his patience. Since you haven't found any diseases or contraband here, Crichton interrupted. We have found it in abundance, Captain, the disease of imagination, fiction, myth, blasphemy, religious heresy, the many forms of the all-pox. Your story of the Huxley is a fiction. You spread the filth of imagination wherever you go. It is in your schools, your speech, your actions, and your minds. Your children are brought up in a madhouse taught by lunatics and devils. Oh, I see, said Picard. It's a good thing for you that your people left Earth centuries ago. Your kind has phased itself out, thankfully, on that planet. Let me make this even simpler for you. In our computer, we have a copy of every notable piece of literature, art, and music ever produced by humankind, from the first Paleolithic cave paintings right up to the present. Everything, no matter who banned it, in whatever country, for whatever reason. Got it? Crichton backed away. He exchanged a glance with Ferris, then looked at the one-eye. In response, the one-eye's surface sprouted a gun. The two security men with the group drew their phasers, but the one-eye, reading brainwaves, had already intercepted their thoughts. It felled both men with a deadly stream of radiation before they could fire. Ferris knocked Picard out with a blow to the head. Riker moved to help his captain, but the One Eye was in his way. It was going to fire at him, and he had no weapon. He grabbed Troi, and they ran until they found refuge in an empty holodeck room. Riker hit his communicator. Riker to Worf.
Worf here.
Worf, the One Eyes are weapons. Put the ship on alert. The captain has been taken hostage.
We are tracking him, sir. They gained entrance to the transporter room.
Riker managed to make it to the bridge just as the transporter room came on the view screen. Chief O'Brien lay unconscious on the platform. Ferris and Crichton entered with Picard. A One Eye hovered over the unconscious chief. Can you tell me what that device is doing to O'Brien? Some kind of scanning, sir. Possibly reading memory information encoded in O'Brien's brain tissue. Possibly it is capable of reading thoughts of active brain waves as well. Riker pondered the remark. On screen, Crichton held Picard's communicator. Yes, thought Riker. Ferris and Crichton would know all about our communicators if their One Eyes had been reading minds. And that is why they were able to outwit and outshoot the crew. Crichton held the communicator to his lips.
Riker, we are going to transport to the surface of Rampart with your captain. We'll return him when I am convinced that you'll leave my world alone.
Believe me, said Riker, I want nothing to do with your world. I'm willing to call off the search, at least for now, if you surrender the captain.
No! I'm not about to risk my planet's safety based on your word.
Commander, whispered Troi, could you ask about the other worlders? The doubt was plain on Riker's face, but Troi continued. I've had time to observe him. I now suspect he is hiding something. It feels like the other worlders. I want to be sure. Riker turned back to the view screen and described Troy's encounter with the other worlders.
Another fiction. Science fiction, the worst of all. You're every bit as sick as the criminals on Rampart, the dissenters. I think you plan to help their insurgency. That's really why you came here.
As Troi watched Crichton's blanching, mask-like face, she sensed that he had indeed experienced the other worlders, or aliens of some similar kind. It was something he could never admit to, something that terrified him. As the crew watched Ferris and Crichton set controls on the transporter, Riker searched for a way to free the captain. But the One Eyes could counter any move he made. In the end, he could do nothing but watch as the men from Rampart beamed off the ship with Picard. Riker sat in the command chair. Data, can you put the beam down point on screen? Yes, sir. An aerial view of a sprawling concrete complex came on the screen. In large lettering, CEFCOM was written on the side of the building. Data studied the sensor information. Sir, this is Security Force Headquarters, highest density of surveillance gear and weaponry. Riker looked at the screen. This is probably where they'll hold the captain, not a place we can beam right into. Data cycled the screen through different wavelengths. There! Riker strode closer to the screen. Underground cavities or tunnels, they intersect the complex foundation. Okay, Data. Select a beam down point 10 to 15 kilometers from the building. You and Troi will beam down with me. Worf, what's the mechanical intruder status? Confined, sir. We should be able to contain them where they are. Riker, Troi, and Data beamed into an abandoned ore factory. Somewhere below it were caves that led to the complex called CEFCOM. Somewhere in CEFCOM, Picard was a prisoner. Data scanned with his tricorder. Sir, there is a humanoid outside the building. A red-haired woman with green eyes entered the factory. She stared keenly at the three from the Enterprise. We're wasting time. I watched you and heard you talking. You are dissenters. Riker stepped forward.
We don't belong to any particular group.
My name is Amoret, the woman said, then waited for a reaction.
Do you object to that word?
Data accessed his memory.
Amoret is a character created by Edmund Spenser, 16th century English poet. No,
Riker told Amoret.
I don't object to it.
The woman looked Riker straight in the eye.
You know the meaning of my name, and yet you claim you aren't a dissenter.
Suddenly Riker looked up. High over their heads, a group of one-eyes hovered in formation.
Enterprise, 3 to beam up. Enterprise!
Data moved a switch on the tricorder.
Sir, we are being jammed. The Enterprise cannot hear us, and there are aircraft approaching.
Riker motioned Troi and Amoret into a small adjoining room, then took cover with Data among the delirium of pipes and catwalks. In the small storage room, Amoret stared tensely at Troi as she listened to the hovering craft. I still think you're dissenters. You were going to Alastor, weren't you? She pulled a wrinkled old page from her coat and showed it to Troi. Will you read this and keep it in your memory? Troi looked puzzled. It's the only piece of classic fiction I've ever owned. Someone has to keep it alive, either one of us. Troi would have declined had it not been for the emotions she felt in Amoret. Troi looked at the page. The words Gulliver's Travels appeared above a drawing of Gulliver himself. At that moment, a CS soldier kicked open the door. He grabbed the page from Amoret's clenched fist. I hereby identify you as criminals and place you under custody of the CS. Riker looked down from his perch on the catwalk. 6 stories below, he saw Ferris standing on the platform along with several CS men and Troi and Amoret. Ferris raised his weapon towards Riker, contempt on his face. The radiation vibrated every cell in Riker's brain. His sensory confusion was absolute. He didn't even know he was falling. On the floor of the factory, Data leapt forward. He stretched out his arms and caught Riker, absorbing the impact. Ferris and the CS men surged forward and surrounded him. Ferris glared at Data.
Put him down, and your weapon too, now!
Data set Riker down. Then, as he threw his phaser, his fingers touched it in a precise sequence. Its beam flashed at a corner of the factory where he had previously detected a cloud of natural methane. A fireball bloomed, and the shockwave knocked everyone over. In the ensuing confusion, Data was recaptured. Troi was knocked backwards into a large open duct pipe. She slid helplessly down the steep angled pipe, finally landing in complete darkness on a soft pile of dirt. Troi found herself near an underground lake. She thought she must be in the caverns that led to Cephcom. If she attempted to enter Cephcom through its underbelly and locate the captain, she'd still need a communicator to contact the Enterprise. No way to know if Riker and Data were with him. She looked at this situation as calmly as she could, but concluded it was hopeless for now. She summoned up the energy to work on her handcuffs. Suddenly, a rustic little rag-clad man came out of the shadows. And what sort of brave, trespassing creature are you, you dark-eyed beauty? The master will want to have a look at you. He continued his inspection of Troi, and when he was through, introduced himself as Caliban. Troi noticed the Shakespearean name. Are there others like you here? Caliban hesitated. Well, yes, others, but with different stories. But they're all dissenters, like me. Troi still felt the otherworlders, not the dissenters, were essential to solving her crisis, but she'd take help where she found it. Can you take me to the dissenters? Caliban started to undo Troi's handcuffs. Let me think about it. While he worked, Troi spotted a large creature flying over the lake. On the creature's back rode an adolescent girl with long dark hair. Crazy Rhiannon, always with that Haiguya beast. The Haiguya alighted near them. It looked rather like a giant hawk. The rider of this creature was about 12, with milk-pale skin. She appeared to have a special relationship with the animal. Troi watched her whisper in its ear and pet its great head. My name's Rhiannon. Do you know the name? Troi had read the Mabinogi as a child and remembered that the fictional Rhiannon was a beautiful grown woman, almost a goddess, who had a special affinity for horses. She was fearless and more than a match for any man, while her horse could outrun all others. From Celtic literature, isn't it? That's right. You are alone? No family? No one is with me. Then you will be part of our family. Spurred by some signal from Rhiannon, the Haiguya moved its mighty wings and bore her aloft. Caliban shambled after them, and Troi hurried to keep up, listening as Caliban mumbled to himself. Be not afeard. The isle is full of noises, sounds, and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not. Sometimes 1,000 twangling instruments will hum about mine ears. They walked for hours along a natural string of caverns. After a bit more walking, the Haiguya alighted in front of Troi, and Rhiannon slid off its back. The animal took off and disappeared into the darkness. Rhiannon turned to the cave wall and spoke. Alastor, another voice answered. What's today's word? Minotaur. A cleft opened in the wall, and Troi found herself in a large, round cave chamber. A figure approached. He was broad-shouldered and had striking blue eyes. His hair was flecked with gray. He examined Troi with a cool stare. I'm Odysseus. Troi sensed his circumspection and self-confidence, and on a deeper stratum, some kind of secret suffering. And this gentleman guarding the door is Nikitushka Lomov, the Volga barge hauler of the Bylini epics. Troi waited to see where Odysseus was leading. And you, are you a dissenter? No, I can't join your group. I'm a traveler. I'm looking for friends who are prisoners of the CS. But now you know the location of Alastor. We can't risk letting you go. You could be a CS informer. You'll have to stay with us, at least for now. Troi persisted. I don't think you understand. Lives depend on me. The CS will execute my people if I don't help them immediately. Odysseus nodded gravely. The CS have tricked us before. You could be another trick. Let me show you where you can rest. Odysseus took Troi to a private cave room and left. After a few minutes, she snuck out, and finding no guard, looked for an escape option. She stumbled on Odysseus's own cave room. He wasn't aware of her presence. He was standing in front of a papered wall, absorbed in old illustrations from the story of Odysseus. The Cyclops Polyphemus, the Trojan horse, a Bronze Age many-oared ship on a wine-dark sea. Near him was a bowl of water. He dipped his hands and splashed the water on his face. So this is how he sustains the persona, thought Troi. He uses props for sense memory like a method actor. Unlike the other dissenters who are named after stories, he actually tries to become a story as a means of overcoming some kind of personal tragedy. Just then, Troi heard dissenters coming up the passage. Unobserved, she stole back to her room. Ship's log. Lieutenant Geordie LaForge recording. We have lost contact with the away team. The one-eyes here on the ship are spreading out, and security is proving unable to stop them. My staff is working on countermeasures for both problems. Geordie's visor showed him a slight increase in the room's heat. Startled, he looked up. Chops! As always, Dorothy Chops Taylor looked a little wild. Her hair was as free-flowing as regulations permitted, and there were hints of improbable colors in it. Her hands, with their metallic finger pads, flexed with ever-present energy. A dark visor covered her eyes. Chops was blind. She could not be fitted with a functioning visor like Geordi's, and instead saw through the sensor pads on her fingers. Dorothy Chops Taylor was Geordi's most valued maintenance engineer. Now she held up a partially assembled communicator for Geordi's inspection. "Incredible," said Geordi. "State of the chops." "And I guarantee the Rampartians can't jam it," said Chops. At that moment, Worf called to say that the One-Eyes were breaking into engineering. Geordi and Chops took refuge in a closet. They listened to the destruction outside, wildly arcing electrical energy, frying circuits, shuddering panels. There seemed to be no pattern to the sabotage. When Geordi and Chops were finally able to emerge, they found that the One-Eyes had severely damaged the warp engines. This Bible sets forth the only true religion. All other religions and philosophies are hereby declared false and criminal. Picard sat on a bed in a small white room, as stark as a prison cell. He leafed further into the book. It was recognizable as a Rampartian revision of the Christian Bible, concerned mainly with proving itself as objective fact. Everything contained in this Bible has been verified as factual truth, and is to be accepted as such and in no other way by the reader. Any interpretation of this Bible as metaphor, literature, or mythology is expressly forbidden. Violators will be subject to the full penalties as determined by the Council of Truth and enforced by cephalic security. What confused people, he thought. They take what should be understood as a metaphorical story and try to make it into science and history. Picard glanced at the video screen built into the wall at the foot of his bed. It perpetually showed news about the CS. On the screen, a report unfolded the capture of 3 criminals. With a sick feeling in his gut, Picard approached the screen and strained to see detail. One was Riker, and the other surely was Data. The third appeared to be a female. Picard sat slowly down on his bed. So Riker and Data had come in search of him. He swallowed his emotions and reminded himself the announcer had said captured, not killed. Picard tried to rationalize. Wouldn't all of them be most useful alive, as hostages? An hour later, Picard was still watching the screen, hoping for more news of Data and Riker. Suddenly his door opened, and 2 CS guards entered. They led him down several hallways to Crichton's office. Crichton stood when they entered and immediately passed judgment on the prisoner. For the high crime specified by the Council of Truth, the detainee before me, Jean-Luc Picard, is hereby sentenced to death. Such sentence to be imposed without delay. As the guards began to pull Picard away, he dug in his heels and twisted around to see Crichton. "Wait. You're holding 2 of my officers. What's going to happen to them? What is happening on my ship?" Crichton shuffled papers on his desk. "Your 2 officers and your crew will all receive the same penalty. Everyone on Rampart who commits a high crime is likewise penalized." Picard's face reddened with rage. "Don't you have trials here? Don't people have a right to defend themselves?" Words emerged from Crichton's mouth like hard, dry pellets. "We deal only in facts, irrefutable facts. For what then do we need trials, lawyers, or judges? A person either committed a crime or they did not. There are no ambiguities for argument. Your crimes were a matter of record as soon as we intercepted your brainwaves. And exactly what are these crimes? Maybe I just want you to look at me and say it. The crime of having an imagination and using it? The crime of speculating or creating, of thinking at all, is that it?" Crichton lifted his eyes and met Picard's. Immediately, Crichton went pale and started to quiver like a slab of aspic. He grabbed his head with both hands. "Get him out of here!" In a cold, sterile lab room, several technicians prepared to permanently dismantle Data and learn his mechanical secrets. Data was bolted to a table. The technicians wore helmets to filter out any fiction or blasphemy the android might try to utter. A trio of one-eyes hovered in the background as guards. Data strained with all his strength against the steel bars that held him against the table, but couldn't break them. Data felt a hand reach behind his back. In the space of a microsecond, he thought of each living being he'd ever known and said a silent goodbye to them all. Troi sat in her small cave room, wreathed in dampness. Since she found no escape option, she decided to use her time as best she could. She decided to contact the other worlders to unlock their secret. She had sensed from the beginning their secret was Crichton's as well. The thought of confronting them again was terrifying, but she told herself she had broken contact voluntarily the first time, and she would do it again. She shut her eyes and opened her empathic sense. She was on a raised dais in the midst of an oceanic multitude of the aliens she called the Other Worlders. Among them she recognized the Lioness and the Mirror Man, but they were only two faces among an endless diversity. They all seemed to be staring at her. Troi looked at her own body. She was nude. Her skin was mineralizing. The inside of her body was changing as well, growing numb and ice cold. The Other Worlders were trying to put her through the transformation they had attempted during her earlier contact. She tried to move, to cry out. She had the feeling that some hidden piece of fearsome knowledge was about to be revealed to her. Troi. Someone spoke her name. She suddenly unfroze and found herself sitting in the cave, back in her proper universe. Rhiannon was shaking her. The adolescent girl had chanced upon her and woken her out of the trance. Rhiannon stayed until Troi regained her equilibrium. Then she led Troi into the cave used for dining. 24 people sat around a huge stone-hewn table, laughing and talking in a dozen different languages. Troi noticed Odysseus standing by the entrance, staring out. She approached him. "You think we're going to be attacked, don't you?" Odysseus seemed fascinated by her perception. "The CS might be out there." "Then why can't you let me leave? Why must I be arrested along with you?" "Neither of us is going to be arrested. The CS are stupid, like Cyclops. We'll protect you." At that moment, Troi was caught in ambivalence. The dissenters seemed so idealistic that she thought she would fare better on her own, and yet she found herself wanting their help and believing they somehow could. After dinner, everyone sat on stones around a pile of glowing embers. Troi found herself next to Guna Bibi, an ebony-skinned woman of Australian Aboriginal heritage. The elderly Guna Bibi explained that she was an expert in the stories of Aboriginal Australia and had named herself after a fertility mother myth. "But tonight, Coyote will tell stories," she said. A white-haired American Indian man stood up next to Troi. In spite of his age, he seemed youthful and strong. Like Guna Bibi, he gave Troi the impression of quiet power held in reserve. "For our newcomer, I will explain that I am a Miwok Indian. My ancestors lived in California, and many of them were Utentbi, professional storytellers, long before the Europeans came. You might say, I'm an Utentbi too. I'm named after a hero of many Native American stories, and I'm going to tell some of them now." He then wove several stories about a mythical coyote, a trickster hero who often worked for the benefit of humankind. He gave people fire and the power of words. Troi asked if the mythical coyote was like an animal or a human, or something beyond either. Each person may interpret the stories as they choose or make up their own, he said. Troi liked his answer. She thought how different these people were from the Rampartians above ground. She asked if someone could explain more about the dissenters. Guna Bibi stirred the embers with a stick and began to talk. My own culture was 40,000 years old when the white colonists came to Australia and tried to stamp it out. I'm sustaining it in my stories of the Aboriginal dream time, as the others here are sustaining their own stories. The people who follow the Rampart way, all facts and regulations, they'll never have the connection with life, nature, universe that the people with stories have. The Rampartians haven't the imagination to see worth in a tree or a mountain. The universe is just so much meaningless stuff to them. They are worthless in their own eyes, just a lot of pitiful animalcules who will work, buy lots of things, grow old, and die, and nothing they have will ease their loneliness or their suffering. The Rampartian Bible claims as an objective fact that the infinite is some real man with a white beard sitting up in the sky, separate and distinct from us. Guna Bibi made an expansive gesture with her arms. But through stories and metaphors, one can see that infinity is here and now, all around us, and we are part of it, and stories can bring one that feeling. Troi began to understand why there was a feeling of camaraderie among all these dissenters of ethnic groups. The dissenters didn't reject each other's stories and mythologies as false. All were metaphors, and all were valid if they worked as a means for personal insight. Troi pondered their precarious situation with their Rampartians. Do you possess weapons? She asked. Do you have anything to fight with? We use the power of our stories for that, said Guna Bibi. We don't believe in using guns. A gun has never imparted knowledge to anyone. Troi wondered how best to respond. As she stared past the embers, a small white object fell from above and landed near her. Suddenly, Odysseus leapt into their midst. Diving for the white object, he threw it toward the cave entrance. Grenade! The CS are here. Save the books! Troi could hear voices outside Alastor. The door stone began to shift heavily, then fell forward with a thunderous boom. 6 CS soldiers broke into the cave, followed by their one-eyes. A nervous young officer whose name tag read Daly confronted the dissenters. This place has been identified as a criminal hideout. All of you are under arrest. A pebble struck Daly in the back of the head. He turned and saw Coyote in the middle of a statue guard. Daly aimed and fired. Coyote leapt from behind a statue just before it burst like a bomb. He took cover behind the stone curves of Venus Calipige. One Eyes flanked Daly as he made his way into the statues, looking for Coyote. Suddenly, Coyote reached up and tugged a rope. A dark mass fell onto Daly and his machines, knocking them all to the ground. An ammonia-like smell reached Troi's nose. She realized that the dark mass was excrement, bird guano, perhaps Haguya guano. She stood poised, ready to take advantage of the confusion and make a break for the door. Suddenly, one of the CS men aimed his gun at her. Odysseus stepped in front of her and shouted one word, "Pneumo!" The soldier fired, and Odysseus pitched forward onto the rocks. Troi felt the ground begin to vibrate. The soldiers looked around in confusion, and then a wild cascade of water burst downwards into the chamber, knocking dissenters and CS alike off their feet. The Pneumo twins, the men named after the mythological water beings, swam in with the water they'd released from their dam. They tackled the soldier guarding the door. The way for escape was clear. Rhiannon guided Troi through darkness and tunnels into a new set of caves, where most of the dissenters already waited. The caverns were smaller than those that led to Alastor. With a sinking feeling, Troi realized she must now be out of the main passage that led to Sefcom. Now, she had no choice but to follow the dissenters. At Science Station 2, Ensign Wesley Crusher searched for a way to stop the One-Eyes. The screen displayed the image of the Dance of Shiva. Wesley almost told the computer to move on to something else when he felt the germ of an idea forming. The dance of the physical universe, the endless round of life and death. He knew even at the subatomic level, the smallest particles oscillate through many states. Matter itself is a dance. He pictured the phases of light matter and dark matter, the neutrinos with enough mass to keep the universe from expanding forever. Enough mass to reverse the expansion and collapse the universe into itself, into a singularity. And perhaps out of that singularity would come another explosion, another universe, like the endless dance of Shiva. Wesley knew that something to do with neutrinos could be used as a weapon against the One-Eyes, and Chops would build it. Since his sentencing 1 hour earlier, Picard had been watching the video screen in his room, trying to pick up useful information. The door opened, and several CS men and One-Eyes came in. Without preamble, they forced Picard down on the bed and began to fasten restraining straps around him. Picard heard his own voice with a new note of fear. "I have proof on my ship that Crichton is wrong. I have evidence that Huxley did disappear here. I have a recorder marker from the Huxley. Crichton is perpetuating a fiction." The CS ignored him. A woman entered with a cart full of machines. Picard had seen the setup in the hall and had guessed what it was for. The woman's name tag said Smith. She wore the CS helmet, but through it Picard could see her green eyes. If he guessed right, she was going to let his body live and give it a new personality. But he, Jean-Luc Picard, would be dead. She began to attach electrodes to his cranium. Picard thought he glimpsed pity in her eyes, the first he'd seen since he'd been in SEFCOM. "Yes, you are different," he said. "You don't believe in what you're doing." She continued her work. She met his eyes again just for a moment, then turned toward the cart. She didn't seem affected by the plea Picard knew was in his eyes. A terrible thing occurred to him. What if Troi had been right all along? More right than she knew about the way he kept his emotions in check. What if now, in this last moment, he was too cold to make this executioner feel enough pity to spare him? He watched Smith slowly remove her helmet. Her green eyes showed her anguish. "What were you trying to tell me?" she asked. "That you're different," said Picard. "You can see that these people try to kill imagination because it comes from deep in the psyche. And they fear what's deep in the psyche. They would sooner kill than look at it. And all their science is wasted. They've decoded brain waves, but still know nothing about their minds. I can show you things that imagination has accomplished. Things that no one on this planet would believe possible. And yet, which came to be because someone once imagined them." Smith's brow furrowed. She nodded slowly. "It's so strange. I've been hearing the opposite all my life, but what you say actually sounds right." "It doesn't matter. I have to carry out your sentence anyway. Even if I set you free, we'd never make it out of here alive." He realized she was crying. "I'm sorry," she said. She replaced her helmet and with a quick, angry motion, pulled a red lever. Later, Smith entered a computer room, carrying a disk. She had no idea that her name had been Smith only for the last 2 days, and that she used to be someone named Amoret. After she had been captured with Riker and Data, her mind had been wiped completely blank. On this planet, such blanking satisfied the legal demand for capital punishment, for the original person was indeed gone. In its place was a new citizen, whose mind was filled with incidents from other people's lives, certified free of the allpox. Once in a while, the blanking didn't work, and the original memories remained. In such cases, the body was killed by injection. Smith stared at the disk in her hand. The CS always kept disks of the minds they blanked, so that facts about the rebellion could be collected. But they had a special plan for Picard. They were going to restore certain parts of his mind to him, certain factual parts. All imagination and creativity would be left out. Picard's disk felt cold and heavy as Smith placed it in the safe. She began to close the door, but stopped. She felt an imperious need to be alone. Late that night, she put the disk on a special viewer and watched the images from Picard's mind unfold on the screen. What she saw felt more right than anything in her gim-crack plastic life as Marjorie Smith. She found she was able to accept that the universe was teeming with life, even though Rampart science told her the opposite. She watched without condemning anything as impossible. She kept skipping around the disk, unable to stop. A plan surfaced in her mind. Raising her eyes from the screen, she saw gray morning light. The rest of the department would soon arrive at work. Quickly, she made a duplicate of the disk and replaced the original in its case. As she was carrying the duplicate to the end of the long storage hall, she heard someone enter the workroom. Silently, she stepped into a large storage cabinet and shut the doors. Then she heard her boss's voice.
Broussard here. How are you, Rob? No, she's not here. She couldn't have left the building, though. She looked at the disk all night. Looks like blanking didn't work. She must be a real sicko. We'll have to put her to sleep for good.
The revelation freed old memories in Marjorie Smith, sitting in a room full of books with other people who called her Amare. And as a little girl, finding a single wondrous ancient page, the contents of which were now lost to her. Quietly, she slipped from the cabinet and ran a few steps to the back entrance. The dissenters had bedded down. Troi was sleepy, too. But first, she wanted to speak with Odysseus. She found him sitting on a ledge that gave him a view of the cave entrances and exits. I was hoping, Odysseus, you would tell me how to get to Cephcom, or am I still a suspected CS spy?
No, we've decided you're no more CS than any of us. You can come with us. We have a mission, a last try at putting Cephcom out of commission.
Troi was incredulous. The entire facility? Is that realistic?
When have you seen me make a misjudgment?
Troi was momentarily at a loss. Finally, she told him she knew he had suffered big losses. It's your wife and son, isn't it? You lost them. You failed somehow. Odysseus stared at her. I knew it from the beginning. You read my feelings, like a seer. You aren't of this world at all. Why is it you'd never said a word about where you come from? Troi wouldn't be drawn further into the conversation. She didn't want to reveal herself and possibly jeopardize her mission. Instead, she waited to see if Odysseus would unburden himself of his woe.
Long ago, I was a high-ranking CS officer. My duty led me to turn in my wife and son as dissenters. They were blanked, lost to me forever, and I suffered a breakdown. All I had left were the stories my family had hidden at the house. The stories helped me deal with my pain. I had to have more of them, so I joined the dissenters. I became Odysseus because that was my son's favorite story. The dissenters walked for several hours along a rushing underground river, then stopped to rest. Troi was the only one who carried no books.
Even the elderly Gunabibi had a sizable bundle, along with a musical instrument she called a didgeridoo. The books were going to be buried in the caves. Gunabibi took a last look through one of them, a volume on Egyptian art. Troi glanced at it and felt as though her heart had stopped. "Who was that a picture of?" she asked. "Sekhmet. She is a symbol of the heat of the desert sun, life-taking and life-giving." Troi realized that the other worlder she'd called the Lioness and the mythological Sekhmet were one and the same, in appearance and meaning. Troi felt as though she were on the verge of discovering something. She asked Gunabibi about other worlders she had encountered, the Mirror Man and the matriarch voice. Gunabibi reached for another book and leafed to a picture of Tezcatlipoca, the dark mirror of Aztec myth who personified the old, shadowy, militaristic side of humans. The matriarch and her mate, Gunabibi suggested, resembled Mother Earth and Father Cosmos, Gaia and Oranos of the Greeks, Awetelincita and Apoyantachu of the Zunya. Troi didn't fully understand her discovery. If the other worlders were mythical characters that had gotten stuck in her mind, then why? Perhaps they were actual living beings that had a will of their own. And what about Crichton? If the other worlders weren't aliens, but in fact characters from mythology and literature, was he guilty of the supposed crime he was charged with eradicating? The crime of imagination? Geordi watched as the weapon against the One-Eyes formed under Chop's sensor-tipped fingers. Geordi knew this struggle to save the ship was a personal fight. How many times had he heard her say that the history of the Earth was full of the blood of persecuted artists? Geordi's thoughts were interrupted by a call from Rampart's surface. Picard's face appeared on his monitor. The captain claimed that negotiations were coming along just wonderfully. "Sir," said Geordi, "I need to verify that you are who you appear to be."
You can ask one of the standard questions.
"I had something else in mind," said Geordi. "What is the book you keep in your ready room from which you most often quote?"
I can't remember that, Lieutenant. This is no time for improvisation.
"Can't you give me a word from it? Just one of the titles, a type of storm, for instance?"
There is no such book. You're babbling nonsense, Lieutenant. I'm going to relieve you from duty.
Geordi cut the channel. Orderlies had come in an hour earlier and strapped Riker to his bed. Lying there, he thought about what a disaster the away team mission had been. Some CS guards entered the room, along with a woman wheeling a device. Ferris and Picard followed them in.
Captain, I didn't think you were still alive.
Hello, Will. It would be hard to explain in your present state of mind, but Ferris wanted me to see you.
That's right, Riker. How we burn the evil out.
The woman started shaving areas on the top of Riker's head. Riker had a terrible, desolate feeling as he looked at Picard. The captain had become a patronizing schoolmaster. Riker supposed this fate awaited him, too. He focused his entire being on finding a way out for both of them. As the woman stuck electrodes on Riker's head, a thought grenade flew in and landed on the floor. Within seconds, everyone in the room became slow and docile. Amarette came cautiously into the room. As soon as she saw the grenade had taken full effect, she slapped off the blanking equipment switches. She jerked Riker and Picard out of the room and down a corridor to the lab where data was stored. The lab's doors clacked against their stops as the CS tried to break in. Amarette frantically slapped Riker's face, trying to bring him out of the thought grenade's stupor. "What's your name?"
William.
"William who?" Riker looked at the doors.
Shouldn't we let them in?
"No!" shouted Amarette. "You need to wake up!" Suddenly, Riker recognized the inert form on the lab table. He put his hand under the android's back and felt for a switch. Data's eyes popped open.
Commander Riker, I am pleased to see you alive, sir. Likewise, I think. And that is a strange hairstyle, sir, said the android. I trust it was not voluntary. As the effect of the thought grenade dissipated, Riker helped Amaret unbolt Data from the table. He peered with concern at the android. You in one piece, Data? Apparently so, sir. Some areas in my thoracic section are exposed, but all memory sectors are intact. That's enough, both of you. Picard stood a few feet away, brandishing a length of metal pipe. Riker stepped toward Picard. Captain, do you remember any of this fiction? To hold, as 'twere the mirror up to nature, to show virtue her own feature? Picard dropped the pipe and covered his ears. Riker threw the pipe across the room and then steeled himself. The captain had always been in prime shape. Riker swung with everything he had. I didn't enjoy that at all, he said, looking down at the captain sprawled on the floor. Amaret finished freeing Data, then quickly explained how she had saved Picard's original mind on a disk, and how her equipment could be used to refill Picard's brain with everything it had lost. Odysseus sat along the bank of the cave river, casting dark looks at Cephcom's outer wall. Troi perceived that his Odysseus persona had shrunk and all but disappeared. He was succumbing to regret over the fate of his family. She thought of how she'd seen him using props and pictures like a method actor, and she realized he'd had to leave those props behind. Now, without them, he couldn't sustain the Odysseus character. She would need his help getting into Cephcom. Her best chance to complete her mission was if Odysseus completed his. She had to help him or lose this chance to get into Cephcom. She tried to talk him out of his depression, but he insisted that he couldn't do the impossible deeds of Homer's Odysseus and thus could never actually be that character. Who are you to say what's possible? Demanded Troi. Who gave you the authority? The people on the other side of that wall think they have it, and look what it's done to them. Odysseus stared at the river. Troi had an idea. She concentrated with all her empathic ability. You're remembering someone you loved, she said. Your little boy, riding on your shoulders, laughing. He turned to her in astonishment. Now you know for sure that I'm a seer, she said. I really do come from another world. If that's possible, then it's also possible that you can be Odysseus. Troi felt a change taking place within him. He walked to the river's edge and scooped up dirt and started rubbing it into his clothes. Troi was baffled, but then remembered that when Odysseus returned to Ithaca, he disguised himself as a beggar. Odysseus joined the other dissenters. Troi could feel them tuning like an orchestra. 24 people of many races and cultures merging into one chord. Then Nikitushka Lomov rolled a boulder off a cliff, smashing the wall. The break-in had begun. Coyote and Gunabibi sat in a stolen van, sabotaging military communications. Gunabibi played her didgeridoo into a microphone, and her song of fertility, the helixing all-note of DNA itself, hummed over headsets and radios throughout Cephcom. Coyote peered out of the van. Outside, confused soldiers scurried about. A few fell to the ground, or covered their eyes, or cried out in terror. They were having seizures in their right temporal lobes. The creative image and music parts of their brains had been starved for so long that Gunabibi's song had triggered wild hallucinations. As Odysseus drove his stolen truck along a service road that ringed the Cephcom complex, Troi watched the disruption through the truck's window. Gunabibi's didgeridoo hummed from the radio. When the song finished, Coyote's voice replaced it.
I'm going to tell a story the Tlingit Indians tell. About the statue that came to life.
Coyote's voice was cut off. Troi heard a muffled sound, and then the voice of a CS officer. Odysseus sped up the truck. We'll still make it, and we'll free the others too, if we can make it to that bridge. Odysseus grabbed Troi's arm and pulled her out of the truck toward the bridge. In front of him, Odysseus could make out the form of a CS officer at the bridge, gun drawn. The officer started running towards them, and suddenly, in mid-stride, pulled off his helmet and cast it aside. Odysseus froze when he saw the man's face. "Ferris," he said in astonishment. The two men were now almost face to face. "Powell, I've been waiting for this for 10 years. A payback for all the men I've lost to your dissenters." Troi sensed something snap inside of Ferris. The controlled mien of the CS military officer gave way to a need for consummation. Ferris thumbed a button on his weapon. She sensed his grim animal satisfaction as he fired. The radiation pattern hit Odysseus square in the chest. The bearded man yelled something unintelligible, then collapsed. One-Eyes and soldiers arrived and surrounded the scene. Ferris once again became the operational military man. He was going to follow procedure to the letter. He unclipped a small case from his belt and squirted CS truth serum up Odysseus's nostrils. "Stay with me, Powell," Ferris said. "I need the names of other insurgents." Odysseus mumbled. "Hurry," said Ferris. "Yamius." "Yamius who?" "Yamius. Pig farmer." Ferris barked orders to his soldiers. "Relay these into the computer. First one is Yamius, a pig farmer." Odysseus seemed to regain the strength in his voice. "Euryclea, my nurse, and Autolycus, and Polypses." Ferris tried to repeat the names to his soldiers, then stopped as the One-Eyes drew up around him in attack formation. In a soldier's reflex, Ferris reached for his own gun. The One-Eyes killed him instantly. As Troi stared at Odysseus, perceiving he was now dead, she heard snatches of conversation between the soldiers. "Looks like Ferris tried to report fiction. But Ferris used the truth drug on that guy, so how could he give Ferris fiction to report? I don't know. Maybe to him it was truth." The CS soldiers began to pull Troi away. She looked one last time at Odysseus. His open eyes reflected the thunder-headed cumulus clouds. The clouds of Zeus Alastor. Zeus, the Avenger. Troi was led into Crichton's office. She sensed the inner terror welling up in him, his terror of the otherworlders, of imagination itself. "You're useless to me," he snapped at Troi. "Your captain, your first officer, and your android are no longer necessary either. I've already defeated your ship. You can't touch me now." An image appeared on Crichton's monitor. The Enterprise was plunging downwards, the dull red heat of atmospheric entry already showing on its shields. Troi strained not to panic, to focus on something else. She found herself looking at his hands. They were unscarred and looked like they belonged to someone else. An artist's hands. They fidgeted compulsively. Now he stood and spoke. "For the high crime specified in the Code of Council of Truth, Deanna Troi is sentenced to bodily destruction by injection." "No, wait," cried Troi. "I know what you're hiding. I've had those mythical creatures invading my mind too. I could help you." Crichton glared at her. "A fabulist to the end." The execution detail arrived at Crichton's office in minutes. Crichton accompanied the CS security men as they led Troi up to the bridge where guards stood in formation around Picard, Riker, and Data. They had barely restored Picard's memory when CS men crashed into the lab and took them prisoner. As Troi saw her crewmates, she felt suddenly weak. For a moment, she blacked out. The guards kept her from hitting the ground, and the whole group paused. When she was able to walk again, the group moved on. Troi and her shipmates were led to a small, stark room. Here they were strapped into chairs. On a table behind them, 4 syringes waited. Troy's heart was pounding so hard, she began to think the earth was throbbing. And suddenly, the earth really was throbbing. The nurse, confused by the noise, dropped a syringe. Crichton screamed at her, "Inject them!" The vibration emanating from the ground reached a peak. Suddenly the roof caved in, and a giant human hand moved in through the hole. It grabbed Crichton and lifted him out of the building. The owner of the hand was 100 feet tall and dressed like an 18th century seafarer. Cords dangled from his arms and legs as though he had been tied up. Troi realized she had seen him before on a page from Gulliver's Travels. This giant was Gulliver, in the flesh. Nearby, Crichton barked orders at the crew of a radiation cannon. The cannon fired a great blast at Gulliver. Gulliver swayed and reached for the cannon. It fired again, and he collapsed. CS troops hurried onto the square, and for a moment, Troi thought they were going to rearrest her and her shipmates. But in the next moment, pandemonium broke loose. A huge crowd of beings swarmed onto the square. A vast invasion by characters from myth, metaphor, fiction, all forms of human imagination. The charge was led by Sekhmet, the lioness, Egyptian goddess of the desert sun. The head of an asp protruded from the hair above her eyes, and over the asp was a blinding solar disk. Troi saw dissenters helping the myth beings. She saw Rhiannon, now a beautiful grown woman in queenly dress, riding a magnificent leaping horse. She saw Gunabibi dancing in the middle of the square, spreading her nature, fertility. Vines grew with time-lapse speed from the concrete at her feet, entwining guns and jeeps in a green arabesque. Crichton frantically tried to rally his CS, but they seemed to be losing, their weapons ineffective, confusion supreme. Some had abandoned the fight and looked around in pure bewilderment. Others were laughing hysterically. Then the colossal Aztec figure of Tezcatlipoca, the Mirror Man, thundered onto the square. Crichton's mask-like face cracked into a bitter smile as he slammed the firing button. A great sound erupted from the radiation tank. The radiation flash reflected off the mirrored surface of Tezcatlipoca's chest and returned straight at Crichton. Crichton disappeared in a cloud of vapor. All around Troi, the myth beings began to rise from the wreckage and walk about. Troi found she couldn't move. She looked down at her hand. It had the appearance of marble. At that moment, Troi realized that she had become a statue. Her body and her emotions themselves were now stone. Odysseus came out of the crowd and stood looking at her. "I know you, do I not? From some other place or time?" He began to pull the debris off of her. "It's all right. I know how to awaken the woman trapped as a statue. Pygmalion, the sculptor, did it once." He touched her wrist. Her hand tingled and came alive. He squeezed her shoulder, and it became soft under his touch. The warmth spread. He stroked her cheek and her hair, and she felt her entire body reawakening. She breathed and moved her limbs. Emotions came back in a rush. She was supremely, inanely happy. Some inner source had been tapped. Some inner conflict released. She opened her eyes. She was alone, lying on her back, staring at a night sky. Then she turned her head and saw that she was surrounded by soldiers. Crichton stood near her. Picard, Data, and Riker were nearby, still handcuffed. She was still on the Cephcom bridge, near the actual spot where Odysseus had died. She had passed out. Then suddenly, Troi felt the unmistakable body-dissolving rush of the Enterprise transporter. In the next moment, she found herself standing in the Enterprise transporter room with her shipmates. The ship was safe, thanks in large part to Geordi and Chops. The engines had been repaired and the One-Eyes destroyed. Picard, Riker, Troi, and Data headed for the conference room to debrief one another. Troi still didn't know how the beam-up had been accomplished. Picard glanced at Data. We have the illustrious Data to thank for that. Unbeknownst to all of us, Data caught and disassembled a One-Eye and fashioned its antenna into a communicator. When all of us were in the same spot, he signaled the Enterprise. He had to keep this device hidden, even from us. Otherwise, the One-Eyes would have read our brainwaves and sabotaged the rescue. Troi beamed at Data. Well, I understand that One-Eyes couldn't read your brain, but how did you disable one in the first place? Data gestured to his shipmates. I will refrain from taxing you with an exhibition, as I have observed a peculiar human reaction to it. However, my poetry apparently stymied the One-Eyes. Troi heard the conference room doors swish open. 2 diminutive people entered. Troi remembered Olaf and Una. They came directly over to Troi. Una looked at her gravely. May we discuss a professional matter with you that seems to have involved your crewmates as well as you? Troi nodded. Olaf took over. We visited Earth not long ago. As ethnographers, we traveled the planet, recording all forms of creative imagination. We used our favorite medium, akin to your holography, which plays directly into the viewer's brain. Virtual reality. Well, as a counselor, you wanted to view our ethnographic movie. We told you that sometimes, though rarely, a life form has trouble with the medium after experiencing it. You insisted on watching all 4 hours anyway. As they spoke, Troy's memories of the meeting began to rise to her conscious mind. I must have blocked it out as a way of trying to suppress the trauma, I suppose. Was there something in your movie about a statue that comes to life? Oh, many things, said Una. There was The Winter's Tale, Pygmalion, a Tlingit Indian story, and others as well. Did you ever show Crichton your movie? Asked Troi. Olaf and Una looked blankly at each other. They hadn't. That meant Troi still had no solution to the puzzle of Crichton. Picard took his seat on the bridge. Nothing more from Starfleet, Worf? The earlier orders stand, sir. We are to leave and let Starfleet handle the matter. The bridge crew waited for Picard to tell them to warp out of orbit. But as he prepared to speak, his communicator came to life. Troi to Captain Picard. Picard here. I think I've found the missing piece to the puzzle. As soon as the gray, drizzly dawn came, Crichton led a troop of CS men to the dissenters' prison quarters. One by one, they were taken from their cells and inducted into the death march. Crichton kept the execution march going, but he felt as though he'd just been pushed into a mental abyss of imagination, of insane fictions. He'd been having the visions for days, and now they were going to overwhelm him. The worst part of it was that he himself appeared in these visions. The stories, full of the Allpox, were always about him. As the execution march reached the bridge, Rhiannon took a last look at the sky. She saw vast gray and white clouds moving in stately unison. High up, in a faraway gap of blue, a flock of birds circled slowly. Rhiannon froze in her tracks. There were no birds on Rampart, but there were Aguya. Now Crichton and the soldiers stopped and looked up as well. The Haiguya pulled into a formation and began to dive. They were diving at the bridge. As they became more visible and more undeniably alien, the other person inside Crichton awoke from his 10-year sleep.
He was Captain Alfred Bowles. He recognized that the stories trying to take over his mind were not fictions at all. They had all really happened to him. The strange vessel that had dominated his psychosis was in truth his very own ship. It was the USS Huxley. Crichton's personality, an artificial construct, folded itself into a corner like a piece of furniture. Bowles was now in control. His Starfleet training told him what to do.
Everybody, hold your fire and lower your weapons.
One of the Haiguya glided down and landed. Rhiannon ran up to the creature, her friend, and spoke to it softly, then leapt to its back and was borne into the air. One by one, the other Haiguya landed, and then took the dissenters up to safety among the clouds.
Aboard the Enterprise, Picard watched the view screen. Data tapped his panel, choosing different views of the CS men, and the man Troi suggested was Captain Bowles of the USS Huxley. Picard peered at his view screen intently. Mr. Data, let's track our man. Data tapped his keypad. On screen, Bowles turned and hurried into the SEFCOM building. Bowles sat at a terminal, his fingers stumbling over the keys. Bowles watched his life as a starship captain unfold on the monitor. He replayed the last images of the Huxley and the CS men polling him out. Only him. Bowles looked away from the screen. Had he heard somebody? There was no more time. He left the terminal and ran to the repository. A startled CS officer complied with the director's demand for an Enterprise communicator. Picard sat in his command chair and waited as his crew tried to contact Bowles. Troi was becoming nervous. Her hypothesis that Crichton was Bowles could be wrong. She might be endangering the ship for nothing. She was about to express this concern to the captain when the bridge speakers started to vibrate roughly.
Come in, Enterprise.
Picard stood up. This is Captain Picard. To whom am I speaking?
To Captain Alfred C. Bowles. Permission to beam aboard your ship, Captain.
Picard turned to Worf. Have the man beamed up. Troi, Picard, and Riker spent a long time talking with Bowles. Large areas of his memory were missing. He still had the knowledge he'd learned at the Academy, but couldn't remember being there. You were torn between two pursuits, said Picard. Starfleet and holography. You were a holograph artist. I expect when you get back you'll be able to visit galleries and see plenty of your work. Bowles was stunned. That could explain why why Crichton had a special aptitude for video images, why he rose through the ranks. Yes, said Troi. I eventually remembered that you had been an artist. Everything fell into place then. How I first felt Crichton was secretly remembering aliens. Then how I felt he was hallucinating fictions. In fact, he was remembering aliens, those he'd seen in Starfleet, but he mistakenly believed them to be fictions. The conversation turned to the future of Rampart. All agreed that the revelation of alien life, of science fiction becoming real, would eventually topple the CS and change life on the surface of the planet. Bowles said his thanks, but before he left, he asked Troi one favor. Please don't tell me too much about my past. I'm in an enviable position, actually, because I get to do that all over again. As he departed and the doors swished behind him, Picard turned to Riker. Why don't you take the bridge for a moment, number one? I need to speak to the counselor. When Riker had gone, Picard turned to Troi. Still having regrets about your choice, counselor? Your risk in the interest of discovery?
My choice to watch Olaf and Una's movie? No. I learned something. I had an anxiety I wasn't even aware of. You remember I had been telling you lately that you were concealing too many emotions.
Yes. We still have a meeting pending on that.
Troi smiled slightly. Well, I didn't know it, but I was actually afraid that I was burying my own feelings. That's why, in my other-worlder dreams, I kept seeing myself turn into a statue. It was my own fear of turning into a cold, unfeeling person.
And will you continue your research on the movie? Picard asked.
Troi felt herself tense up. I want to, but the flesh is weak. That research was what started my trances and amnesia.
Counselor, I'm not suggesting you should do anything you don't want to or anything dangerous. I just hope you'll one day continue with the research. That's all.
Troi could feel the wheels turning in Picard's mind.
Deanna, do you remember that big number you once told me about?
You're talking about the number based on average synapse count of possible states of one human brain. The number of possible thoughts and feelings one person is capable of.
I think that's it, said Picard. How big did you say it was?
2 raised to the power of 10 trillion.
Yes, and that's more than all the grains of sand on all the planets in the universe. More, in fact, than the total number of atoms in the entire known universe.
Troi looked Picard square in the eye. I know what you're telling me. I won't give this up. The captain was right, thought Troi. She sat down to her computer. If you start backing away from knowledge, there's no end to it. Computer, I wish to commence with some research. It was a crucial moment. She was going to speak the title of Olaf and Una's movie, the word that had started the whole thing last time. She gripped her chair until her fingers hurt. Tell me about the Tukurpa, she said. What does the word mean? She held her breath and waited for the room to begin spinning, for her world to start disintegrating. Working. Tukurpa. A word used by several Aboriginal peoples of Australia. It refers to the eternal ones of the dream, the beings of myth, or the myth world itself. The eternal dream time. Do you wish further information? She let herself breathe again. Nothing terrible had happened. She was still in her chair, in her cabin, on the Enterprise. Her anxiety seemed to have evaporated. In its place, she felt relief and the exhilaration of embarkation. Yes, she said.
Gulliver's Fugitives was written and adapted for audio by Keith Sharee. It was read by Jonathan Frakes. Post-production was by Gary Fink and Karen Perlman. Original music by Sam McCallie, Carl Schertz, and Richard Emmett. The director was Jesse Boggs,